ever thought being single was just a modern trend? Think again. History is packed with moments where choosing not to tie the knot or delaying it was not about swiping left, but about literally staying alive or holding on to your world. We are talking about times when saying "I do not" could mean escaping poverty so dire it claimed millions. Like after Ireland's Great Famine, when over 1 million people vanished and average marriage ages shot up by nearly a decade for survivors. Or imagine women in 19th century China creating all-female households, pooling resources from silk factories, just to avoid arranged marriages that often meant a life of servitude. Some even held spirit weddings to deceased men to secure their independence. From medieval women building their own thriving communities outside the church's direct control to individuals dodging life-threatening persecution by being unburdened by family ties. The choice of singleness has been a powerful, often uncelebrated tool for survival. Get ready to see history in a whole new light. Number 6. When the world burned, they chose the desert and said no thanks to marriage. Picture the Roman Empire, not in its shining marble glory, but in its later centuries, say from the 200s to the 400s Common Era. Things were getting messy. Political stability was a distant memory, with emperors rising and falling like dominoes. The economy was creaking under the weight of constant wars, heavy taxation, and disrupted trade routes. Cities, once bustling centers of life, faced food shortages, disease, and the ever-present threat of barbarian raids or civil unrest. For many, the world felt like it was teetering on the brink. It was a time of deep anxiety and searching for meaning. Within this crumbling world, a new faith, Christianity, was spreading. And some of its most devout followers looked at the chaos, the corruption, and the everyday pressures of Roman life, and decided they wanted out, not just out of their towns or cities, but out of the whole system of societal expectations, including marriage and family. For these individuals, the path to true spiritual survival, to a life dedicated wholly to God, lay in radical simplicity and withdrawal. They became known as the Desert Fathers and Mothers, the early Christian ascetics. Their choice of singleness was not about romance or lack thereof. It was a profound statement and a survival strategy for their souls, and sometimes for their very lives. The call to the desert began as a trickle, then became a stream of people. One of the earliest and most famous was Antony the Great, born around 251 Common Era in Egypt. When he was about 18 or 20 after his parents died, he heard the gospel passage about selling all possessions and giving to the poor. He took it literally. He entrusted his sister to a community of virgins, sold his inherited property, gave the money away, and headed for the outskirts of his village, then further into the desert itself. He sought a life of solitude, prayer, and fasting, away from the distractions and temptations of the world. His idea of survival was to battle not barbarians, but his own inner demons and worldly attachments. Marriage, with its responsibilities for a spouse and children, its entanglement with property and social standing, was seen as one of those primary attachments to a world they believed was passing away. These early hermits or anchorites believed that, to be truly close to God, they needed to strip away everything else. Family life, while respected in general Christian teaching, was for them a barrier to the intense, focused spiritual discipline they sought. In the harshness of the Egyptian, Syrian, or Palestinian deserts, they lived in caves, abandoned forts, or simple huts. Their days were structured around prayer, often reciting psalms, meditation, and manual labor, perhaps weaving mats or baskets to trade for the minimal food they needed, like bread and salt. Water was scarce. The sun was relentless. Wild animals were a real danger, yet thousands followed this path. By the end of the 4th century, figures like Jerome wrote of the deserts being populated by these monks. Why was this a survival strategy? Spiritually, it was clear to them. The world was a sinking ship, and they were getting into the lifeboat of ascetic devotion. By remaining single, they could dedicate 100% of their energy, time, and resources to this spiritual quest. There were no spousal duties to distract, no children's needs to meet, no in-laws to manage. Their celibacy was a key part of this detachment. It was a freedom from the entanglements that, in their view, trap souls in worldly concerns. There were also practical, if unintended, aspects of physical or social survival. As Roman society became more unstable, withdrawing from it could mean escaping some of its direct pressures. Heavy taxes like the capitation tax could be crushing for families. Military conscription was a constant demand. Civic duties in declining cities could be onerous. By living on the margins, sometimes literally outside the reach of tax collectors or recruiting officers, these ascetics found a different kind of existence. Their poverty was a shield. Their lack of dependence made them mobile if necessary, though many stayed in one place for decades. It was not just men. We hear of Amos or desert mothers like Syncletica of Alexandria, born to a wealthy family in the 4th century. After her parents' death, she, like Antony, gave away her inheritance, cut her hair, and with her blind sister, moved to a tomb outside the city to live a life of austerity and prayer. She attracted other women who sought her guidance, forming an informal community. Amma Theodora was another who offered profound spiritual advice, often emphasizing humility and the inner work of the soul. Sarah of the desert lived for 60 years by a river, battling temptations and offering wisdom. For these women, remaining unmarried and embracing asceticism was one of the very few paths available to pursue a life of spiritual authority and independence in a patriarchal society. Marriage would have meant subordination to a husband and domestic responsibilities. The desert offered a radical alternative. The life was incredibly tough. The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, a collection of anecdotes and teachings from this period, speaks of intense spiritual struggles, referred to as battles with demons, which often manifested as temptations of doubt, despair, lust, or pride. They faced extreme loneliness, physical deprivation, and the psychological challenges of prolonged solitude. Abba Arsenius, once a tutor in the imperial court, famously prayed, "Lord, lead me in the way of salvation." And a voice told him, "Arsenius, flee mankind and you will be saved." He took this to heart, avoiding visitors as much as possible. Survival here meant enduring these trials to achieve a state of apatheia, or dispassion, a calm freedom from disturbing emotions. Around 320 Common Era, another figure, Pachomius, organized a different model. Instead of solitary hermits, he established Cenobitic monasticism, where monks lived together in organized communities. They still practiced celibacy and poverty, but they followed a common rule, worked together in trades like farming or baking, and supported each other. These communities also became a form of alternative society, providing structure and sustenance when the outside world seemed to be falling apart. Numbers grew rapidly. Pachomius's first monastery at Tebenzi in Egypt reportedly housed hundreds, and by his death in 346 Common Era, there was a congregation of several thousand monks and nuns in 9 monasteries. This communal form of singleness also proved to be a resilient survival strategy, both spiritually and economically. Communities were largely self-sufficient. The impact of these choices was monumental. These early desert dwellers, by choosing singleness and radical devotion, laid the foundations for all Christian monasticism, East and West. The rule of Saint Benedict, which shaped monastic life in Europe for centuries, drew heavily on their traditions. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and economic activity throughout the Middle Ages. The ideal of a celibate clergy also gained strength from their example. While the Roman Empire in the West eventually fragmented and transformed, the legacy of these individuals who chose a singular path in the desert endured, shaping religious and cultural landscapes for well over 1,000 years. They did not set out to save civilization, but to save their souls. In doing so, they created a way of life that survived the ruins of an empire. Number 5. Dodging death and disaster. How being single was a secret weapon in terrifying times. History is not always kind. There are periods when your religion, your ethnicity, or even your political leanings could put a target on your back. Think of times of intense persecution, civil wars, or invasions. In these terrifying scenarios, the ordinary structures of life, like family and community, could suddenly become liabilities. And for some, being single, unencumbered by dependence, was not a lifestyle choice, but a grim, pragmatic key to survival. It meant mobility, the ability to hide more easily, and fewer people to worry about or protect when every decision could be life or death. Let's journey to late 15th century Spain, around 1492. This was the year the Catholic monarchs, Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand I of Aragon, completed the Reconquista by conquering Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. It was also the year they issued the Alhambra Decree, ordering the expulsion of practicing Jews from their kingdoms. Jews were given a stark choice: convert to Catholicism or leave within months, forfeiting much of their property. For centuries, Jewish communities had been part of Spain's vibrant Mayel fabric. Now they faced catastrophe. Imagine being a Jewish head of a household at that moment. You have a spouse, young children, perhaps elderly parents. How do you uproot everyone? Where do you go? The roads are dangerous, the sea voyages perilous. Every extra person is another mouth to feed on a journey with no certain destination. Another loved one, vulnerable to bandits, disease, or the cruelty of officials. For a single individual, the odds, while still terrible, were different. A young man or woman without family ties could travel lighter, move faster, blend into a crowd more easily, or perhaps find a quicker, albeit risky way to board a ship. They might have a better chance of finding temporary work in a new, unfamiliar land to sustain themselves. This is not to say their suffering was less, but their logistical capacity for flight was undeniably greater. Estimates suggest that anywhere from 40,000 to 200,000 Jews were expelled. The decision to leave was agonizing for all, but for those alone, the calculus of escape was simpler, if no less heartbreaking. Consider also the conversos Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, in the decades and centuries prior. They were under constant suspicion from the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 to root out heresy. If a converso was accused of secretly practicing Judaism, their entire family could be implicated. A single converso, living discreetly, might have a slightly better chance of avoiding the intricate web of neighborhood spies and informants. If denounced, they faced only their own trial, imprisonment, or worse, without the added horror of seeing their children or spouse dragged down with them. Singleness, in this context, could be a shield of obscurity. Fast forward to 17th century France and the Huguenots, who were French Protestants. After decades of religious wars, the Edict of Nantes in 1598 had granted them substantial rights and a measure of peace. But this tolerance began to erode under King Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, and then catastrophically under King Louis X. In 1685, Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes with the Edict of Fontainebleau. Protestantism was outlawed. Churches were demolished, schools closed. Huguenots were forced to convert to Catholicism. Their children were to be baptized and raised Catholic. Pastors were given 2 weeks to either convert or leave France. Ordinary Huguenots were forbidden to emigrate. This set off a wave of clandestine escapes. For a Huguenot family, especially with young children, fleeing was a nightmare. Children could cry at the wrong moment, alerting patrols. They slowed down the group. If caught, the penalties were severe. Men sent to the galleys, a virtual death sentence. Women imprisoned, children taken away. A single Huguenot, however, had options. They could disguise themselves as a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or a laborer. They could take dangerous, less traveled routes over mountains or through forests. Young, unattached women might try to pass as servants. Young men could try to sign on to ships. Their lack of dependence made them less conspicuous and more adaptable to the sudden twists and turns of an escape under duress. Around 200,000 Huguenots are thought to have fled France despite the prohibition, seeking refuge in England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, and even the American colonies. For many of these individuals, their unattached status was a crucial factor in their successful flight from persecution. They carried their skills and determination, but not the burden of ensuring the safety of an entire family unit in transit. Let's shift to another scenario. Times of intense political upheaval and purges. Consider the Soviet Union under Stalin in the 1930s during the Great Purge. Accusations of being an enemy of the people could come from anywhere. A jealous neighbor, a disgruntled colleague, an overzealous party official. Once accused, arrest, interrogation, imprisonment in the gulag, or execution often followed. If the accused was married, their spouse often faced persecution too, labeled as a family member of a traitor to the motherland. Children could be sent to orphanages. In such an atmosphere of pervasive terror, being single and perhaps living a more isolated, inconspicuous life could, for some, reduce the chances of being entangled in someone else's downfall or being targeted through family connections. While no one was truly safe, a smaller personal network might mean fewer potential points of betrayal or accusation, even in situations not involving overt state persecution. Being single could aid survival during extreme social disruption. Think of the California gold rush, starting in 1849. Thousands of people, overwhelmingly men, flocked to California dreaming of riches. Many left wives and families behind, or were single to begin with. The journey itself was arduous and dangerous, whether overland across the continent or by sea around Cape Horn or through Panama. Life in the gold fields was rough, lawless, and often violent. Disease was rampant. Having no dependents to provide for or protect in such a chaotic environment allowed these individuals to take greater risks, endure greater hardships, and move quickly from one rumored gold strike to another. Their singleness was a prerequisite for the kind of mobile, high-risk life the gold rush demanded. Survival here was often about individual resilience and luck, unhampered by family responsibilities, in a place utterly unsuited for settled family life in its early years. Throughout history, in these and countless other moments of crisis, singleness provided a stark advantage for maneuverability and reduced liability. Did not guarantee survival. Far from it. But in a world turned upside down where the usual social supports became dangerous entanglements, the ability to move alone and unencumbered sometimes tipped the scales between escape and capture, between life and death. It was a strategy born of desperation, a lonely path trod by those whose primary goal was simply to see another sunrise. Number 4. No husband, no convent, no problem. Medieval women who built their own world. Let's step into medieval Europe, roughly between the 12th and 16th centuries. For a woman, life paths were often quite narrow. You could marry, and your life would be largely defined by your husband and children and the demands of running a household, or if you were religiously inclined, and perhaps from a family that could afford the dowry, you could enter a convent, taking formal vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living a life secluded from the world under the strict rule of the church. But what if neither of these options quite fit? What if you were a devout woman who wanted to live a spiritual life, but also wanted to remain active in the world, to work, to support yourself, and to live in a community of like-minded women without the beguine commitment of monastic vows? Enter the beguines, starting in the late 12th century, primarily in the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and Netherlands, and spreading into Germany, France, and other parts of Europe. A remarkable movement of lay religious women emerged. These women, who were not nuns in the traditional sense, chose to live either alone or in communities called beguinages. They were single or widowed, and dedicated themselves to piety, charitable work, and often skilled labor. Their choice of an independent celibate life outside the usual structures was, in many ways, a remarkable survival strategy, socially, economically, and spiritually. Context was a time of religious fervor and urban growth. Towns were expanding, trade was flourishing, and new forms of religious expression were bubbling up. For women, particularly in urban centers, opportunities were limited, but the desire for a meaningful, autonomous life was strong. Many beguines came from prosperous bourgeois families, but others were of more humble origins. What united them was a desire for a deeper Christian life, one that did not require them to renounce the world entirely like a cloistered nun, nor submit to the authority of a husband. A beguinage was often a collection of small houses, sometimes with a shared infirmary, a church or chapel, and workrooms, often enclosed by a wall, creating a town within a town. The Grand Beguinage of Leuven in Belgium, founded in the early 13th century, still stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, giving a sense of the scale these communities could reach, sometimes housing hundreds, even over 1,000 women. Each beguine typically had her own small dwelling, maintaining a degree of personal independence. They did not take permanent vows. They promised obedience to the head of their beguinage, the Grand Mistress, and to live chastely only for as long as they remained a beguine. They were free to leave, and some did perhaps to marry or to return to family. They also retained control over their own property. This flexibility was key to their survival and appeal. Canonically, beguines were often self-supporting. They engaged in various trades, most notably textile work, spinning, weaving, lace-making, embroidery, which were significant industries in cities like Bruges, Ghent, and Antwerp. They also worked as nurses, cared for the sick and the poor, taught children, and copied manuscripts. Their labor contributed to the urban economy, and their earnings allowed them to maintain their independence. In a society where an unmarried woman outside a family or convent could face poverty and vulnerability, the beguinage offered a secure and respectable alternative. It was a collective survival strategy, pooling resources and skills. For example, the beguinage of St. Elizabeth in Ghent, founded around 1234, had its own brewery, bakery, and farm by the 14th century, making it highly self-sufficient. Spiritually, the beguines were part of a broader movement of lay piety known as the Devotio Matera, which emphasized personal devotion, meditation on the life of Christ, and practical good works. Many beguines were mystics, women who experienced profound religious visions and wrote influential spiritual texts. Figures like Hadewich of Antwerp, 13th century, Mechthild of Magdeburg, author of The Flowing Light of the Godhead, who spent her later years in a beguinage, and Marguerite Porete, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, who was controversially condemned and executed for heresy in 1310, are associated with this movement. Their writings, often in the vernacular language rather than Latin, made complex theological ideas accessible to a wider audience. For these women, remaining single was essential to their intense spiritual lives and their intellectual pursuits. Marriage and child-rearing would have left little time or space for such deep contemplation and writing. However, their independence and their sometimes unconventional theological expressions also brought suspicion from the church hierarchy. Because they were not under the direct control of a male religious order in the same way nuns were, and because they claimed direct experience of God, they were sometimes accused of heresy or moral laxity. Council of Vienne in 1311–1312 condemned certain beguine practices and beliefs, leading to periods of persecution in some regions. Some beguinages were suppressed or forced to affiliate with established monastic orders like the Franciscans or Dominicans to ensure their survival. Despite these challenges, many beguinages adapted and endured for centuries. The number of beguines was significant. It is estimated that in some cities like Cologne in the mid-13th century, beguines may have constituted as much as 10% of the adult female population. By the year 1300, there were perhaps as many as 200,000 beguines across northern Europe. This indicates how powerful this alternative way of life was for women seeking autonomy and spiritual fulfillment. The Ben movement offered a third way, a space where women could live with dignity, purpose, and relative freedom. Their singleness was not a state of lack, but a foundation for community, economic self-reliance, and a rich spiritual life. They created their own rules, their own spaces, and their own support systems. While the movement eventually declined due to various pressures, including the Reformation and changing social attitudes, the beguinages represent a fativating historical moment when singleness, embraced collectively, became a strategy for women to thrive and carve out a unique place for themselves in a world that offered them few other options for such independence. The last beguine, Marcella Patten, died in Belgium in 2013 at the age of 92, marking the end of an almost 800-year-old tradition. Number 3. Too many women? Not enough? Husbands? How Victorian ladies reinvented single life. Picture Victorian Britain from about 1837 to 1901. It was an era of massive industrial growth, imperial expansion, and rigid social codes. For women, especially those of the middle and upper classes, marriage was widely seen as the ultimate goal, the primary path to social respectability and economic security. A spinster or old maid was often pitied, sometimes ridiculed, and frequently portrayed in literature as a marginal, unfulfilled figure. But beneath this surface, a demographic and social shift was happening that forced many women and society as a whole to reconsider the place of the unmarried woman. And for a growing number, singleness, whether by choice or circumstance, became less a tragedy and more a path to new kinds of survival, independence, and even influence. One of the stark realities of mid to late Victorian England was a demographic imbalance. There were significantly more women than men, particularly in the marriageable age groups. Census figures consistently showed this trend. For instance, the 1851 census for England and Wales revealed around 104.2 females for every 100 males. This gap was even more pronounced in certain age brackets and social classes. Factors contributing to this included higher male infant mortality rates, men emigrating to the colonies in larger numbers, and men serving in the military and dying in wars or from diseases abroad. The result was what contemporaries called the surplus women problem, or sometimes more judgmentally, the retundant women issue. Hundreds of thousands of women, statistically speaking, were unlikely to marry simply because there were not enough available men of a similar social standing. This demographic reality created a profound challenge. Prevailing ideology, often called the cult of domesticity, idealized women as wives and mothers, angels of the household, sheltered from the harsh realities of the public sphere. But what about those who could not, or chose not to, fulfill this role? For middle-class women whose upbringing often did not include training for a profession, the prospect of lifelong singleness could mean economic vulnerability, a life of genteel poverty, often dependent on the charity of relatives. The primary respectable occupation for such a woman was often that of a governess, a poorly paid and often isolating position. However, this very pressure also sparked change and opened up new avenues. The surplus women phenomenon fueled debates about female education, employment, and legal rights. If women could not all marry, they needed other ways to support themselves and lead meaningful lives. This period saw the slow but steady expansion of educational opportunities for girls and women. New schools and colleges for women were founded, like Queen's College in London in 1848 and Girton College, Cambridge in 1869. These institutions provided women with intellectual training that went beyond the accomplishments traditionally taught to make them marriageable. As women became more educated, they also began to push for entry into new professions. Nursing, famously professionalized by Florence Nightingale, herself a single woman who rejected marriage to pursue her calling after the Crimean War, 1853–1856, became a respectable field for women. Teaching in the expanding state elementary school system also became a major employer of unmarried women. Office work, with the invention of the typewriter and telephone, opened up new clerical jobs for women towards the end of the century. Retail and the newly emerging department stores also provided employment. While wages were often low and conditions could be poor, these jobs offered a degree of economic independence that was previously unavailable to many single women. For these women, remaining single was intertwined with their ability to pursue these careers, as many professions like teaching often had marriage bars requiring women to resign upon marrying. This era also saw the rise of the new woman towards the end of the 19th century. This was a term often used with a mix of fascination and disapproval to describe an independent, educated, and often politically aware woman who challenged traditional gender roles. She might ride a bicycle, smoke, shocking, advocate for women's suffrage, and pursue a career or intellectual interests rather than focusing solely on finding a husband. For the new woman, singleness could be a deliberate choice, a way to preserve her autonomy and dedicate herself to her work or causes. Figures like social reformer Beatrice Webb, who married later in life but had a long period of influential single intellectual work, or writer George Egerton, married Chevalita Dunn Bright, who explored female desire and independence in her fiction, embodied aspects of this new model. Furthermore, some single women found ways to create fulfilling lives through social reform movements, charitable work, or artistic pursuits. Women were prominent in campaigns for temperance, abolition earlier in the century, public health, and education for the poor. Octavia Hill, a single woman, was a pioneering housing reformer who developed new models for managing social housing. Josephine Butler, though married, campaigned fiercely against the contagious diseases X, which unfairly targeted women. Single women often had the time and freedom from domestic responsibilities to dedicate themselves to such public work. For some women, lifelong singleness also meant forming deep, supportive relationships with other women. The phenomenon of Boston marriages emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in New England, but also in Britain. These were long-term committed cohabitations between two women, often financially independent and educated. While the nature of these relationships varied and is debated by historians, they provided companionship, emotional support, and domestic stability outside of heterosexual marriage, allowing women to pursue professional and intellectual lives. Writer Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Adams Fields had such a relationship for over 2 decades. The numbers are telling. In 1871, about 14% of women aged 45–49 in England and Wales had never married. While this might seem modest by today's standards, it represented a significant cohort of women forging lives outside the marital norm. Their existence and the public discussion around it slowly chipped away at the idea that a woman's only value lay in marriage. Singleness, for many Victorian women, transformed from a perceived failure into a space where they could, to varying degrees, achieve economic self-sufficiency, intellectual engagement, and social contribution. It was a quiet revolution born out of necessity, but leading to profound changes in the roles and opportunities available to women. Their survival strategy involved not just enduring singleness, but reshaping what singleness could mean. Number 2. Silkworms, sisterhoods, and saying nope to husbands in 19th century China. Imagine the Pearl River Delta region of southern China, particularly in areas like Shunde County, Guangdong Province, during the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was the heart of a booming silk industry. The intricate process of cultivating silkworms, reeling silk from their cocoons, and preparing it for export created a huge demand for labor, and much of this labor was performed by women. This economic opportunity, almost unique in its scale for women at the time in China, gave rise to a fascinating social phenomenon. Groups of women who actively chose to resist marriage, or to participate in it only nominally, forging independent lives and strong female communities. Their choice of singleness, or a modified form of it, was a direct strategy for economic survival, personal autonomy, and freedom from the often harsh realities of traditional Chinese marriage. In traditional Chinese society, marriage was nearly universal and considered essential for continuing the patrilineal family line. A daughter was expected to marry, move into her husband's household, obey her in-laws, especially her mother-in-law, and produce sons. Her status was often low, and her life could be one of unremitting toil and subservience. Personal happiness or choice in a partner were rarely considerations. Marriages were arranged by families, often when the individuals were very young. However, the flourishing silk industry in the Pearl River Delta, which really took off from the mid-19th century with the growth of international trade, changed the equation for some women. The work in the silk villagers or reeling factories was demanding and required skill, but it also provided women with an independent wage. This was revolutionary. For the first time, young women could earn significant cash incomes, sometimes more than men in agricultural work. This economic power gave them leverage and options they had never possessed before. Out of this context emerged the marriage resistance movement, or girls who dress their own hair, referring to the traditional coming-of-age ceremony where a girl's hairstyle was changed to signify she was marriageable. These women performed it for themselves, signifying their intention to remain single. Some women would take a vow of celibacy, often in a public ceremony with other like-minded women, sometimes held in a local temple. They would pledge to support each other and live independently. These women often formed sisterhoods or golden orchid associations. These were groups of women, sometimes a few, sometimes dozens, who bonded together for mutual support, companionship, and economic cooperation. They might pool their earnings, live together in shared houses called girls' houses or spinsters' houses, and provide for each other in sickness and old age. These houses became female-controlled spaces, free from male authority. Within these sisterhoods, deep emotional bonds were often formed, providing the companionship and support that might otherwise be sought in marriage. Some historians suggest that these bonds could sometimes be romantic in nature. The income from silkwork was crucial. A skilled silk reeler in the late 19th or early 20th century could earn enough to support herself and even save money. This financial independence was the bedrock of their ability to refuse marriage. Why submit to a potentially difficult marriage and demanding in-laws when you could earn your own living and live with your chosen sisters? Some women who resisted marriage did so for their entire lives. By the early 20th century, it was estimated that in some silk-producing districts of Shunda, up to 10% of adult women were part of these marriage-resistant sisterhoods. In certain villages, the numbers were even higher. For women who faced strong family pressure to marry, or who perhaps desired the social status of being married without its actual constraints, there were other innovative strategies. One was compensation marriage. A woman might agree to an arranged marriage but pay a sum of money to her husband's family to be excused from the usual marital duties and cohabitation. She might return to her natal village or her sisterhood after the wedding ceremonies were completed. Another, more radical option was spirit marriage, where a woman would marry a deceased man. This gave her the status of a widow, which in some ways offered more autonomy than being a wife. She would be part of her husband's lineage, perform ancestral rites for him, and might even adopt an heir for him, but she would be free from the daily obligations to a living husband and in-laws. She could continue to live independently, or with her sworn sisters. These choices were not without social costs. Marriage resistors were often criticized by conservative elements in society for defying tradition and filial piety. They might face pressure from their own families. However, the economic power they wielded and the solidarity of their sisterhoods provided a strong counterweight. Moreover, in some communities, these women, with their earnings, could actually contribute significantly to their natal families, perhaps helping to support parents or pay for a brother's education, which sometimes earned them a degree of acceptance or tolerance. The daily life in a girl's house would have been a hive of activity. Women would go to work in the villagers, often long hours in hot, steamy conditions. In their shared homes, they would manage their finances, cook, clean, and engage in social activities. Festivals and rituals would be celebrated together. The older women would guide the younger ones. This collective living was a key survival strategy, providing not just economic security but also emotional and social sustenance. The peak of this phenomenon lasted from roughly the 1860s to the 1930s. The decline of the silk industry, partly due to the rise of synthetic fibers like nylon and the global economic depression of the 1930s, eroded the economic base that had made this independence possible. As factory jobs disappeared, women lost their independent incomes, and the marriage resistance movement faded. Changing political and social ideologies in China in the mid-20th century also discouraged such alternative lifestyles. Nevertheless, for several decades, tens of thousands of women in the Pearl River Delta carved out a unique existence. Their decision to remain single or to redefine marriage on their own terms was a powerful assertion of agency in a society that offered women few such choices. It was a survival strategy that allowed them to escape the potential hardships of traditional marriage, achieve economic self-sufficiency, and build strong supportive female communities. Their story is a remarkable testament to women's ingenuity and resilience in shaping their own destinies when given even a small window of economic opportunity. Number 1. After the hunger, why Irish folks started marrying super late or never. The Great Famine and Gorda Mór, which struck Ireland between 1845 and 1852, was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The repeated failure of the potato crop, the staple food for a huge portion of the population, led to mass starvation, disease, and emigration. Over 1 million people died, and another million or more emigrated out of a population of around 8.5 million. The trauma of the famine seared itself into the Irish national consciousness and brought about profound, long-lasting changes in Irish society, including a dramatic shift in marriage pattern. For generations afterwards, remaining single or marrying very late in life became a widespread, deeply ingrained strategy for survival, not just for individuals, but for the entire rural social and economic system. Before the famine, Irish rural society, particularly among the poorer classes, was characterized by early marriage and large families. Land holdings were often subdivided among sons, leading to smaller and smaller plots, many just large enough to grow potatoes to feed a family. Potatoes' high yield on small plots of poor land allowed this system to persist. Marriage was relatively easy. A small patch of land and a cabin were enough to start a family. The average age of marriage for women was around 21, and for men, around 25. The famine shattered this world. The reliance on a single crop proved disastrous. Subdivision of land was now seen as a direct path to poverty and starvation. The experience of the famine taught a brutal lesson. A large family on a tiny plot of land was incredibly vulnerable. Survival for the family farm and for the community demanded a radical change in how land was inherited and how families were formed. In the post-famine decades, a new system emerged, particularly in rural areas. Practice of impartable inheritance became much more common, where the family farm was passed intact to a single heir, usually the eldest son. This was to prevent the land from being broken up into unviably small units. But what did this mean for the other siblings, the non-heirs? For them, the options were stark. Emigrate. Find work elsewhere in Ireland, which was scarce, or remain on the family farm as unmarried dependents, contributing their labor but without their own holding or the means to support a family of their own. This new inheritance system had a direct and massive impact on marriage. The heir, the son designated to inherit the farm, would often delay marriage until his parents retired or passed away, sometimes well into his 30s or even 40s. He needed to wait until he had control of the farm and could support a wife and children. His choice of wife also became more strategic, often involving a dowry, a match, that could help the farm's finances. Love was a secondary consideration to the economic viability of the union. For the non-hiring sons and daughters, the prospects for marriage within their local community were drastically reduced. A man without land or a secure trade found it very difficult to marry. A woman whose family could not provide a dowry or who had no prospect of marrying a man with land also faced limited options. As a result, large numbers of people simply never married at all. Lifelong celibacy became a common feature of Irish rural life. The statistics are striking. By the early 20th century, Ireland had one of the latest ages of marriage and highest rates of permanent celibacy in the world. In 1926, for example, nearly 25% of men and 25% of women aged 45–54 in the Irish Free State had never married. The average age of marriage for men had risen to around 35 and for women to around 29, significantly higher than pre-famine levels and higher than in most other Western countries at the time. In some Western counties, where land was poorer and the famine's impact was particularly severe, the rates of celibacy were even higher. This pattern of late marriage and high celibacy was a direct consequence of the famine and the restructuring of the rural economy to prevent a recurrence of such widespread destitution. It was a societal adaptation, a collective survival strategy. By restricting marriage and family formation, the pressure on land resources was eased. Fewer mouths to feed on the farm meant a slightly better chance of making ends meet. It was a harsh system, often leading to lonely lives for those who remained unmarried, and it fueled continuous emigration as those without prospects at home sought opportunities abroad. Millions of young, single Irishmen and women left Ireland in the decades after the famine, sending remittances back home that became crucial for the survival of their families and communities. For those who did remain single in Ireland, life could be difficult. Unmarried women often lived with their parents or a married sibling, contributing to the household labor. Unmarried men might work as agricultural laborers or remain on the family farm, subordinate to the inheriting brother. The term confirmed bachelor or old maid became common, and while not always stigmatized in the same way as in other societies, given how common it was, it still often meant a life without the companionship of a spouse or the experience of raising one's own children. The Aisling or vision poem tradition in Irish literature often lamented the decline of youth and vitality in the countryside, with themes of emigration and lost love. This demographic pattern persisted for a very long time, well into the mid-20th century. It was only with increasing urbanization, industrialization, and a general rise in living standards from the 1960s onwards that Irish marriage patterns began to change significantly, with marriage ages falling and rates of celibacy declining, moving closer to those in other developed nations. The legacy of the famine, therefore, was not just in the landscape of ruined cottages and memorials, but in the very fabric of Irish family life for over a century. The decision, or often the necessity, for so many to delay marriage or forgo it entirely, was a profound social adaptation to an overwhelming economic and existential crisis. It was a strategy of careful, often painful demographic self-regulation aimed at ensuring that the horrors of the Great Hunger would not be repeated. The vanishing Irish, as some called them, due to high immigration and low marriage rates, were a people forever changed by a period when survival meant making choices that reshaped the nation.